Hi everybody, I wanted to start the lecture this week with a quick introduction. I realize it's already going to be a couple long weeks of discussion about the war on drugs, but I want to position myself before this and let y'all know just a few things about me. First and foremost, that I'm a drug addict, and I want to point that out so that we know that as we move forward in this discussion, my lectures come from a personal perspective in this case. I'm speaking especially next week when we get into some of the lies we've been told that have in fact hurt people like me and have led to a situation where right now 70,000 Americans are overdosing and dying every year in this country based in large part on cultural lies we've been told in the furtherance of political power. I do want to make sure that everybody knows that I identify as an addict. I'm still an addict. I'll always be an addict. And that's something that I place first and foremost out there. So again, if we had been in a normal class, I would have disclosed this earlier on, but this format of online is a little different. And if you're just stumbling into this video online, clearly then you haven't been in any classes at all. But I do want to make sure that as we talk about these things, everybody knows that this is personal to me. Today we're going to talk about the beginning of the war on drugs. And as you've seen, if you've looked ahead in the syllabus, I've decided to devote 2 weeks to this. I think one of the first things to point out with the war on drugs from an American context is that we usually don't even begin to hear the story of the war on drugs in this country until the mid-'80s. Quite often when the term the war on drugs is used or brought up, we think of Ronald Reagan and maybe even a little bit with the Clintons and the Bushes, where the war on drugs was sort of doubled down on. And I want to spend this first week really focusing on what happened to get the war on drugs off to a start and why it was that we came to not remember historically the real roots of the war on drugs. So I want to go back 100 years and I want to start there and talk about, among other things, the opium poppy, which is what this is, and the other drugs that were made illegal. So I've assigned a reading to go along with this, and it was a section from Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream. I really like what Hari has done here, so anybody that hasn't read this book, I would strongly encourage you to go get it if you're looking for some more information on the roots of the war on drugs. But I want to follow Harry's timeline and then add to it a little bit and flesh out exactly what happened with the war on drugs and add to what he said. Again, one of the things I really want to reiterate throughout all of our discussions about drugs and the war on drugs is that what we often think of as a new crisis or a new catastrophe isn't so new. And so I've thrown a couple dates on some different drugs that have been developed or synthesized, as it turns out later, in the progress of opioids. And the dates are important to recognize because as soon as these chemicals began to be synthesized, they were by and large distributed to the public who often consumed them, and sometimes people suffered from addiction. Other times they used these chemicals recreationally and had no problem. But we can go back more than 200 years and see that there is a history of drugs. So when we hear now that we are in the midst of a opium crisis and we have reiterated to us the reality that 70,000 drug addicts overdosed and died last year in America, a number that should bring a tear to all of our eyes. When we hear these things, we need to make sure that we don't construct what is going on as some sort of new crisis, but that we keep it in a historical context. I also want to point out, to go along with what Hari said, that when Anslinger took office in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which would later become the DEA in America, America was on the way, socially, sort of swinging away from this idea of prohibition. And so I've thrown up this chart of years that have to do with the prohibition of alcohol in our country. And I want to point out that amidst these other ideas surrounding intoxicants that we now call drugs, because nowadays we draw a very distinct distinction between drugs and alcohol for some reason in our country, even though they're both drugs, that America had gone through this experiment of prohibition, had legally written it into a constitutional amendment, and we had decided this does not work, we don't want this, and that America was swinging away from prohibition when Anslinger took office. So Anslinger had a really big task upon his hands. This is what the country looked like at the time, and again, this is often a story we don't hear about the war on drugs. You could walk into what amounted to the local Walgreens and purchase things like morphine or even heroin after it was manufactured, most of the time without a prescription. A lot of these things were actually sold in mail order catalogs and what is the JCPenney or Sears catalog. And you could literally order things to be delivered to your house. There was a preloaded syringe at one time loaded with heroin that you could purchase directly from the Sears catalog and have it delivered to your door, and you could keep your supply up. For a long time at the beginning of the 19th century, the point to make here is there was no real cultural terror surrounding drugs like there is today. When we all hear this story and consider what would the world be like if they sold heroin-loaded syringes to anybody with internet access to be mailed to their house, we all sort of have this dystopic image of the world falling into shambles. In reality, I want to point out that that's not what was going on. As we are going to talk about throughout both weeks, when drugs are not only legal but they're readily available, they become very cheap and they are usually regulated. It's very difficult to find contaminated alcohol in America because it is a regulated industry. On the same note, it's very seldom that you find store clerks who are willing to risk their license to sell to underage people. So this regulatory market naturally develops when drugs are allowed in a country, but when you block them off, you immediately create a black market. And we saw that in the reading this week, as Hari so eloquently described. But a few things to point out here. There was a time in America early in the 20th century where the Supreme Court had ruled that doctors that had heroin or cocaine addicts or methamphetamine addicts who showed up in their office and said, I am struggling with this substance, I'm physically dependent, and I'm not really sure that I am ready to stop. Doctors were allowed to, even obligated at times, to write a prescription to these people to maintain their addiction. And incredibly, contrary to what we might all think, these addicts would then go out into the world and live incredibly successful lives. 22% of actively using addicts were rich, were wealthy in many of the surveys that were done at the time, while only a small portion, 6% in the survey that I'm referring to here from Hari, were poor, were below the poverty line. And this is important to recognize that that is not the world we live in anymore. We are 100 years into drug prohibition, and we have made a system where if you are a long-term drug addict, you are very likely to be poor in this country. That's just one of the many consequences of the way we've sort of established this in the last 100 years. Enter a man named Harry Anslinger, and as you read in the Hari reading, Anslinger is sort of one of the main architects of not only the war on drugs, but dog whistle politics, which would establish over the course of the next 30 or 40 years and come to be a much more under the radar practice later on. But as you'll notice when we talk about Anslinger, he was incredibly good at talking about issues without diving directly at what he meant. And he could evoke this sense of fear in the general public without ever getting directly to the point. He let your imagination do it for you. What Anslinger was really good at above all else is the spectacle. And so here's what I want to connect to the modern war on drugs, as we're going to talk about next week, is that Anslinger realized that there was a mass media machine that was evolving and growing as it had been for some time in America, but it was connected to technology and to image and to spectacle. And what Anslinger began to do is to pose for these high quality, sharp photographs of things that lent themselves to front page stories or to newspaper portrayals. And in so doing, then he would send these photographs to newspapers along with a government report of what was going on so that the newspaper could publish and not worry about libel. They had a good story. And the newspapers time and again had to decide if they were going to go with a story that they maybe didn't have an image for, or that perhaps the image was somebody who was sent out to the countryside with an old camera. And the competition was against that in this sort of spectacle where you could see Harry himself with the gun on and maybe the best photograph that you might see for that few weeks show up in a newspaper. So the spectacle. Harry realized early on that if he could tie into a machine that already existed, he could get the media to do the work for him. Anslinger was also really good and got into publishing his own pamphlets, and Reefer Madness is a direct result of the sort of thinking that it was established through Anslinger's rhetoric. He published this book called A Marijuana Assassins of Youth, and in it made some incredibly outlandish claims that in this day and age would strike us all as absurd. just like when we watch Reefer Madness, some of the things you see in there you can't believe anybody ever took seriously, and yet we know that there was a time when the media atmosphere was such that you could read something by Harry Anslinger called Marijuana Assassins of Youth and get a very bizarre picture of what was going on. Maybe Harry's biggest trick was to begin to associate marijuana with race without ever actually doing it. And one of the most clever ways he did this was to villainize marijuana with an A, with the J in this case, but often with an H, and you would pronounce it marijuana, as opposed to the cannabis that many people had, cannabis tinctures that they had once again purchased from local mail order catalogs or from local pharmacies. This was a drug many people had in their own cabinet, and they certainly weren't afraid of it or the effects that it had on people. Nobody was taking marijuana tincture and realizing that they then didn't know what happened for the next 6 hours, and they woke up covered in blood and the house was ruined and there was some violent event that happened. On the contrary, nobody was really worried about cannabis. They had used it medicinally for years. But when you began to call it marijuana and associate it with immigrants that were coming from Mexico at the time, he tapped into what has really been a groundwork of America from its very root, which has been the racism of those in power, traditionally white rich folks. And so you can see Anslinger time and again would play both cards. He would send photographs. In this case, he's got a shoe that had a secret compartment. But things that, as a media consumer in the early 20th century, with no internet, no television, very slow newspaper traveling, these were great stories. These were the stuff of like fiction almost. And so the newspapers, by and large, had no choice but to run with these stories. And as we'll see, they weren't always just stories about drugs. Almost always there was some race and some class or some gender in this case, the fear that the man is going to come along and sort of corrupt the white woman with drug use. And somehow the marijuana, in this case with the hard H, is somehow going to lead clearly directly to hardcore drug use. And many of us have seen some of these things that are now the stuff of pulp legend. I have this one hanging on my wall at home. And we can begin to see, though, that as we move more and more towards what became mainstream, as the competition in newspapers popped up, Anslinger started to insert race even more poignantly. And I think the most important example, or the first example, rather, with Anslinger that made history, was this man, Victor Licata, who was actually the son of some Italian immigrants who were in America. But when you look at this picture in black and white, as it was always published in that day and age, because we didn't have cameras as we do now, there's race sort of built into it in ambiguous ways. You're not sure if you're looking at a white man or if you're looking at a person of color. And Victor Licata is actually, Licata is the name of an Italian city. So the name itself already evokes sort of ambiguity in racial terms. And when Harry Anslinger told the story of Victor Licata and said he had murdered his family with a butcher knife because of marijuana, he sort of tied these two things together, marijuana, mind you, not cannabis, in the minds of many people who began to now have this irrational fear of the substance itself. And now you can think of this in terms of media and how the media works even to this day and age. When a story hits the mainstream press and they begin to compete, often the headline or the title is what gets you the clickbait, if you will, that you read the first sentence or two and you want to go to it. And just as in now, the media back then would do the same thing. And so it went from just small term stories where maybe he was a sideline to now second or third page to maybe the front page. And now newspapers began to tell the story in more enticing and titillating ways. Crazed by smoking marijuana, man kills 6 people. Right? Dream Slayer talks and sell. After he murdered his family, he was talking in a haze of permanent marijuana insanity. These are the things that sort of took up steam, and they gained steam, and they begin to spread and propagate across culture, because in America this is what we've always eaten up. We love the spectacle. And these stories begin to spread. So you can imagine now that as one newspaper realized how successful it had been, or another nuspaper had been with running the story, they began to look for other stories that mirrored it and that could garner that same monetary reward. And this resulted quite often in not only racist portrayals, but also in misrepresentations. Again, in this case, a family eats marijuana and they are permanently insane. Anslinger also tied marijuana to the jazz industry and sort of tried to demonize both along with black folks. And this is another shout out to sort of the very roots of the dog whistle, this beginning to separate race from the talk about race, and how you can see even back then race is quite often the center word in this case, and yet somehow you could look at this and say, well, race isn't really mentioned. And the same thing here, marijuana was time and again associated with Mexican immigrants. And you read some of this stuff in the reading, so I won't belabor the point, but also I think it's a really interesting historical note in America that many historians now grant that the reason we use the caliber weapons we do in law enforcement in America is by and large due to racist tropes like this that circulated through the newspaper. And I'll invite you once again to read Hari's rendition of this to maybe get a better understanding. Opium followed suit. We had cocaine as it was tied to black men, and we were told that they would lose control and have superhuman strength. And in the same regard, Anslinger was adept at associating opium, which is something we also all had in our medicine cabinets, only it was called morphine or Laden or heroin. But when he used the term opium and he distributed high quality pictures of smoking, which is a ingestion method Americans by and large weren't used to seeing, he did the same sort of connection of racial ideology and drug use to fear, to this underlying fear that America's had. And he did what many politicians since and before have done. He used racial animus to sort of propel his supporters to support policies that in the end were in their worst interests. Billie Holiday was briefly touched on, and I do want to point out that the war on drugs, Billie Holiday was one of the first visual and public casualties. And as you read the rendition, Anslinger really made Billie Holiday a personal target and went after her to the point where even though she was in a hospital dying of numerous ailments that were incredibly painful and she was addicted to heroin, he had his agents withdraw her heroin so that she would also detox and suffer an agonizing death while going through the throes of physical agony of heroin detox. And on the other side of that equation, as was mentioned in the reading, Judy Garland was a white famous actor who right now is actually incredibly getting ready to have a biofilm come out in Hollywood about her. So if you want to watch that, that may tie in and you may see some of this in that. She was addicted to heroin for a long time too, but when Harry Anslinger found out that this white cultural icon, this powerful woman who was in Hollywood and who young girls looked up to, was addicted to heroin, he called her into his office and asked her to take a vacation. And as a historical side note, because this wasn't in the part of Harry's book that I asked you to read, Joe McCarthy actually was discovered to be addicted to opiates as well, and at one point Anslinger called him in and said, "Oh my God, what is going on? This isn't possible. You have to quit right now." And McCarthy said no. And it turns out that the history books have now revealed, we found, where Anslinger set up a connection for Joe McCarthy to get his narcotics for the rest of his life free on the government's tab. We as taxpayers paid for Joe McCarthy to legally consume heroin and morphine while other people, including Billie Holiday, were prosecuted to death because of the same war on drugs. So right from its very root, what I want to point out before you dive into the reading a little bit more in the discussion boards is that the war on drugs has incredibly racist and classist roots. And we're going to follow those through to next week to how it plays out right now, contemporarily, and where we're at with the prison industrial complex. And we'll begin to see these same patterns pop up next week.